Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and today I'm going to be talking about the Alliance Tournament once again. However, unlike last time, I'm going to be talking more specifically about the week that has just gone by, and generally trying to recap it, as a lot has happened, and in general it's kind of unwise to assume that everyone's been able to watch every match that has gone out, especially seeing as the fact that half of the matches simply didn't have any official coverage or commentary given to them. And I'm going to be doing this in 4 separate sections. The first thing I'm going to be looking at is the key moments, the storyline impacting and kind of pivotal ways in which the Alliance Tournament itself has been flowing. For example, upsets or, the results of major matches. The second is simply matches to watch, matches that I personally found interesting for various reasons, and I think the average viewer will enjoy watching. Hopefully this will allow people to pick out the gems that might otherwise get lost in the chaff. The third section is just going to be me discussing the meta a little bit, kind of giving a view of what comps are being used, why they're being used, and kind of how they operate on a more mechanical and fundamental level. And then finally, just everything else. Anything that doesn't fit in a regular category and is kind of worth at least mentioning, I'll put in there. Make sense? Great, then let's get on with it. So let's start with probably the biggest story to come out of the first weekend of the Alliance Tournament, which was Hydra getting upset in the first match they played this Alliance Tournament. And whilst they don't seem to be that shaky in the losers bracket so far, it's worth noting just how unbelievably against the odds this was for Templar's Kalsif. Hydra was not just considered a favourite in that particular match, they were considered a favourite in the whole tournament, with multiple co-commentators of mine believing quite firmly that Hydra were the most likely people to raise the trophy at the end of it. And this doesn't just bump up Templar's Kalsif in terms of people's assessment of how good they are by showing that they can beat these S-tier teams that are typically considered top contenders for the tournament, at least in a best of one. It also serves to put Hydra on thin ice, and this is because one of their previous best strengths has been with theory crafting in making compositions that no one else has thought of and understanding exactly how to execute them. An important part of their ability to utilize this strength has come with their ability to hide setups until the final weekend, where they are most effective at defeating top-tier teams like Pandemic Legion, the Tuskers, etc., etc. Being knocked down into the losers bracket makes hiding these setups a lot less viable for Hydra, as they can no longer simply bring a baseline setup and just hope that their execution will carry them through. Whilst it might, that might is a lot more dangerous without the safety net that being able to drop into the losers bracket provides. Once the losers bracket thins out, especially towards the third weekend, we're going to see Hydra, I think, bring a lot more of their late game setups, their final weekend setups typically, and try and use those to push through wins and basically lock them down to ensure they're at least in the top 4. And that's going to be very, very scary for them, as it's going to put them at a disadvantage, especially when you have teams like Pandemic Legion, like the Tuskers, who've shown an ability to react to setups if given enough time. For example, PL's Maraca setup in response to Hydra's Atana Widow setup previously. And of course, Hydra being knocked down into the losers bracket really screws with the seeding of the whole tournament, leading to teams like Pasty Syndicate, who were top 16 last year, being knocked out 0-2 after being, semi-upset by the very, very strong Laserhawks team, and then simply shot in the back of the head by Hydra in their first match in losers. Which only further emphasises how kind of bad the random seeding is within the confines of the Alliance Tournament, when you compare it to the line that Pandemic Legion has been able to forge through the brackets, going up against Good at This Game and the Clown Car to already place themselves in the top 16 this year. And this has only emphasised by probably what is one of the overriding things that the commentary and analysis teams have been noticing during this first week, which is that these new teams, or at least some of them, are incredibly potent. And while some of this can be attributed to the wider adoption of more tournaments into the EVE mainstream, letting people think about the tournament for longer, and generally giving people a chance to practice, that doesn't account for all teams. There are teams that have basically come out of nowhere onto the scene and are incredibly good. For example, the Penis Out teams, or Salt Farmers. And whilst we obviously have to wait and see if these teams have the strategic acumen that will allow them to burn through a proper 3-match series against a top-tier team, I wouldn't be surprised if we see at least one of these teams be able to do that. There's just so many new teams that have the raw skill and raw theory crafting behind them to make that possible. In fact, one of the most interesting storylines that has started to develop because of the prowess of these new teams is the question of if we'll see a new team break into the top 4 in potentially its rookie year or after a major rejuvenation of the team. Right now we have this pseudo-pantheon of old guard teams who seem to be the only people capable of cracking that top 4. Teams like Pandemic Legion, Tuskers, Hydra, as I've mentioned before, but also We Form Volta, Exodus, NC Dot, those kind of teams. A team like Laserhawks being able to defeat multiple Tier 1 teams and break into that illustrious bracket would kind of change the face of tournaments to some degree. It would show that there is a new breed of team out there willing to take the throne from people. And that just makes for a great storyline, at least for me. It's an underdog story that actually might happen. I can't help but imagine, for example, what the final might look like if it was, for example, Tuskers versus the Salt Farmers, with the Salt Farmers having gone through PL or Hydra to get there. I think that would make for an amazing storyline. But seeing as the AT isn't an anime, that's fairly unlikely to happen, but I can still enjoy thinking about it. But moving onwards from my own personal Alliance Tournament fanfiction, let's get to the facts of things and look at some of the matches that you absolutely must watch if you want to really get a feel for how the first weekend went. First up is Test Alliance Please Ignore going up against the Ronin. Now these are 2 good top 16 level teams, really duking it out and putting that all into something that we don't see very often, which is frigate logistics. And both of these teams utilize them in such an interesting manner that you should watch it. It was a very close match, very interesting, and very good execution from both sides. And in all honesty, that's all I want to say about it, because I don't want to spoil the ending. It went down to the absolute wire. The next match I want to recommend is Project Mayhem versus Snuffed Out. And this is for 2 real reasons. The first is obviously that these 2 alliances are close allies on Tranquility. They work together a lot, and now they're facing off the Alliance Tournament, and that's pretty cool. You get to see who really wears the pants in their relationship. But beyond that, the actual match itself was very interesting, and it showed a little bit of how the meta has developed since AT14, where a flagship Balgorn was so central to how the overall meta played out. And that's changed now. You can see that Snuffed Out was able to bring a composition which was kind of able to deal with it, using their bizarre grapple rattle fit to neutralize it and kill it off, because it was poorly used by Project Mayhem. However, I also want to highlight some of the clowniness that can only happen in the first weekend of the Alliance Tournament, and recommend you also take a look at Whole Control versus Snuffed Out. It is a hilarious match to watch. Would never happen later on in the tournament, but what does happen is great. It features, 2 Vindicators, a full Galante rush setup, being warped in at 0, with the enemy fleet also bringing their, flagship Balgorn in at 0, because YOLO, why not? I'll leave what happens next as a quote-unquote surprise for those of you who go and watch it, but trust me, it's great. The final match I want to recommend is obviously the big storyline match of this weekend, which was Hydra going up against Templis and losing. whilst the result is obviously the most impressive part of it, the match itself is also very interesting and great to watch. Whilst it wasn't directly streamed by Eventy, a Leeson moderator went back and re-recorded their commentary of it, so go check it out. So with those recommendations in order, let's rev up the Rambletron 5000 and get really deep on the meta itself. And rather than talk about the importance of what ships are being brought, I'd like to take a step back and talk about the importance of what ships aren't being brought and the impact that that has. And I think it's something that's obviously overlooked on the analysis desk, simply due to the fact that we don't have time to really explore the ramifications of it. One thing that's very notably missing is the lack of top-heavy comps. For example, the double Fleet Typhoon, then basically all support comps that we saw last Alliance tournament during the early parts of the bracket. And this is in part due to the fact that battleships are now a lot more expensive to bring. And this in turn has impacts on the kind of rest of the meta. Without those top-heavy battleships, you can't keep logistics alive as well because you don't have heavy rep drones. And heavy rep drones are significantly better than any amount of medium rep drones you can bring to keep your own logistics alive against DPS. And this makes comps that focus on your logistics better. It's a very circular thing, but it's very interesting to note, and I think very important to note. Equally, we've seen RLML All-In, which was a key staple in the AT14 meta, be heavily banned. And this is due to two real reasons. The first being that teams weren't entirely sure if RLMLs would be nerfed by the time of the tournament, and therefore kind of didn't theory craft as heavily as they possibly could around it, under the assumption that the nerf that was proposed would be going through, only to have that then clarified by Fozzie on, I believe, Twitter. And the second being that RLML All-In is actually very scary for what I consider the level 1 comp of this tournament, which is the drone shotgun that we saw Tuskers bring in their first match. As a comp like that, there are a fair few things that you don't want to see, but some of the most important things that you don't want a comp that can potentially outkite your drones or use the MJDs to really lessen your damage. You don't want to see a comp that can apply at long ranges, so they don't need a large amount of offensive control to keep you within range. And then finally, you also don't want a comp that can apply to cruisers very well. And RLML All-In combines all three with a package that can also kill an Aneros if you decide to bring those as an adaptation. And this means that by either banning the Cerberus or the Scimitar, you effectively force your opponent to take into account the possibility that you could bring that drone shotgun setup. This simply keeps the pool of options that you have and that your opponents have to prepare for you having is as wide as possible, which in this early on in the tournament only favours the more experienced and deeper theory-crafted team. One thing that's a lot more easy to see in terms of the comps being brought by teams is the rise of distributed cores. And what I mean by that is the rise of using cheaper DPS ships in order to increase the threat density of your team. With the norm being to use T1 cruisers like Moas, Vexes, and to a lesser extent Thoraxes and Malas, but we've also seen the rise of Tech 1 battle cruisers, specifically not Navy, such as the Harbinger and the Ferox being used in the same role. And this has a lot of impact on how the tournament matches themselves even play out. We've seen a lot more bloody and quick matches this tournament, primarily just because there's more DPS being brought to the field, and also because there's not the same level of battleship utility which could be used to protect their core and peel for it, which, when combined with the heavy tackling that Moas and Vexers can provide for a team, just leads to ships getting picked off from a composition, held down, and then the battle really starting. As now both these comps can apply their huge DPS numbers to something, and from there on it just gets bloodier and bloodier, with one team eventually snowballing an advantage and whittling down threats as fast as possible in what are effectively very, very high and skill-intense DPS races between the two teams. And that, cyclically, is another point at which these distributed cores come into their own. Something you'll hear us talk about in the commentary team is about the amount of threats that either side has left on the field, and start to ignore the E-War support, which is meant to be there to delay the death of their own logistics in the hope that they can get an advantage in threats by that point. And generally, the team with the most threats on the field is going to be the one that will eventually win the match. Which means that, for example, if you bring a Mala instead of a Vengeance like you would have in previous tournaments, your support then becomes a threat into itself and something that your opponent has to take into account when they come to racing, potentially making them waste a lot of DPS on a low value target for you, whilst your main threats are left unmolested because they perceive that other support as more important. And even if they don't, you're still going to have more threats later on in the match. I can't say for certain that this is something that will continue throughout the entire tournament, but I hope it does. And this only amplifies the power of drone compositions, which are arguably some of the best in this tournament so far. And that's because they get to use some cheap but incredibly efficient options in this kind of distributed core that coincidentally also happen to be great at killing enemy logistics, which then forces opposing teams into this race. Specifically being able to take advantage of the relatively powerful for their cost Vexor Navy issue, and to a lesser extent the Myrmidon. And whilst without Tech 2 sentries and drone-assisted marauders, I don't expect them to become as cancerous or as meta-defining as they have been in previous tournaments, they are going to play a key role in devaluing the power of Tech 2 cruiser logistics, simply because large swarms of drones are incredibly good at killing enemy logistics, as they're able to track enemy logistics and crucially apply enough damage to break any sustained tank without the need for offensive control, which could potentially be screened by an enemy team. This effectively serves to make the various Logilus drone shotgun compositions shown by teams in the first weekend the quote-unquote gatekeeper of the format. This means that if your setup can't possibly deal with that composition, it's either about to die in a fire, or you have meted out your opponent and think you have a good read on what they're bringing and are bringing the counter to what you think they're bringing, which obviously leaves you open to then getting shit on by the drone shotgun, but hey, that's a simple leveling game for you. This comp as a strong counter to very all-in on protecting the Logi comps is one of the reasons why, along with a lot of power bans against the Aneros and Guardian if you don't plan on bringing a armor comp yourself, is the reason why we've seen a rise in the usage of frigate logistics. And this is due to the fact that because these teams which are focusing on drones don't need a lot of offensive control in order to apply their damage, they generally start to lack offensive control, typically just using one hyena as their single source of it. And whilst we have seen a slow move to bringing in Hugans or double hyenas to the setup, it's still not enough to effectively neutralize the mitigation that a frigate logistics can bring to the field, effectively allowing you to have more sustain in your composition. And whilst you might not save every ship, you're going to make sure your threats last significantly longer than a Logilus drone setup. I don't have too much to say otherwise on the topic of T2 frigate Logi, but if you want to hear about how fun and interesting they are to pilot, you should definitely check out Apothene's article on the matter of logistics in general in the Alliance tournament, which covers T2 frigate logistics in depth. I'll link it in the description. One final point I wanted to touch on in terms of things to look out for in upcoming matches is the comp that was brought by Tuskers in their final match of the first weekend, which was a kind of an AT-12 throwback, as it were, combining double Sleipnir and double Healer together, which were two ships that were incredibly powerful in that tournament and still hold a lot of power here. And that's because this is the kind of setup that I expect to see a lot more of as the meta of the tournament progresses away from the initial starting point of drone spam is OP and into something a little more nuanced. And that's specifically because this comp seems the best placed to take advantage of the distributed core we've talked about earlier. It combines the force multiplying effects of command ship boosts with a couple of resilient threats in the healers, and then adding to that the distributed core concept that is so powerful. Multiple Feroxes, multiple Mowers, going in there and causing a lot of damage without taking too much of your point budget to field. So look for other teams in the future to start to bring their own flavour of this kind of composition. So with the meta at least mildly raised, let's take a look at everything else that's been going on kind of around the tournament and talk a little bit about that. The first thing of note is the fact that some teams have only just realised it and started to flood Reddit with posts about how 500MN Hicks were killed pre-tournament by the banning of the activation of the warp disruption field generator modules without the scripts inside them. What this had previously allowed for is 500MN Hicks that were able to go at ludicrous speed and with fairly good agility right at the start of the match, potentially allowing them to catch logistics or other high-value target before it can get away from a rush setup. And whilst it wasn't particularly points efficient, it was a very unique strategy and something that could have made the opening weeks of the tournament even more exciting in my opinion. However, it would have also impacted the viewing experience of those watching the Alliance tournament, as a gigantic bubble effect obviously obscures what's going on underneath it, making it harder to see smart bombs or neutralizing effects or, to a lesser degree, E-War. And given that the Alliance tournament is, of course, a show, that's something that's of a high priority. Another thing that really bears mentioning in terms of the overall impact on the tournament, whilst not kind of the meta in general, is just how many flagships have died already. 5 flagships have died in the first weekend of the tournament, and these are not by bad teams. These are teams that are at least mid-card competitors like Snuffed Out and Project Mayhem. And this is obviously something that's going to track these teams throughout the rest of the tournament. Something that I'm going to be very interested to see is in the second and third weekends, are teams that are top tier willing to risk losing such a potentially powerful tool in a meta which is evidently very hostile to flagships, or are they going to attempt to sandbag it until the final weekend where it can really pull out on its own, especially in a format which now includes 3 bans? Still, currently we're en route to potentially have an AT where the most amount of flagships ever have been destroyed, and I would really like that to happen. Because for me, that just puts a capstone on what this meta seems to be, which is high DPS, always fight, all in, and I love it. It makes for such exciting viewing. Hell, even inside drone matchups, which are typically considered fairly boring to watch, I've had a lot of fun looking at the individual piloting that's required to defend and even utilize a drone comp well. One pilot in particular I'd like to commend here is Jose, a member of the ABBA DOT team, or A Band Apart, who is able to survive for way, way longer than he should have by getting off 2 consecutive mobile micro jump drives in order to kite off the enemy drone blob that was following him. Well, that about wraps up everything that I feel is worth talking about in week 1, so I won't waste any more of your time. Make sure to tune in at 1400 Eve time to the Eve NT Twitch for more glorious spaceship violence. But until then, fly smart and take care.